Despite World War I aviation being almost entirely consisting of biplanes, many very effective monoplanes existed. Those include the Junkers D1, the Fokker Eindecker, the Morane Saulnier Type N. Wait, what's that? It was bad? How bad was it? Oh, it was really bad. Huh. Welcome back everyone, and today I've got an exciting new build for y'all. Eduard released their new tool for the Morane Saulnier a few years back, I think, and I was excited to try it out. Opening up the box, the kit only contained a few parts, which really got me excited because I could get to painting faster, which is going to be really interesting for this build. Apart from that, it contains the usual goodies that Profi Pack kits come with, a photo etch fret, some painting masks, and of course good quality decals. As usual, we start off by assembling and painting the cockpit. I clip off the parts from the sprue with some side cutters and then carefully clean them up with the Hummy blade and some sandpaper. One of the most interesting parts of this aircraft is the instrument panel, or, well, the lack of one. This was typical for a lot of early war aircraft as, well, you didn't need many instruments. Most aircraft were equipped with gauges for the RPMs, the fuel gauge, maybe the engine temperature, and, well, that's it. It was simply an unnecessary waste of space to fit them all on an instrument panel that would block the machine gun operation, and so they were just mounted along the sides. The kit requires the engine to be assembled as one of the first parts because the engine cowling is molded with the two main fuselage halves, which is an interesting decision. You usually don't see that too much on World War I stuff. And speaking of the fuselage halves, of course, this being a Profi Pack kit, there were some parts that need to be sanded off or removed and replaced with photo etch parts. It is good to be extra careful in these moments because you don't want to cut too much or remove too much of the original part so that you have a disfigured fuselage. But like I said, the kit is very simple, so let's get to painting. I started off with taking some extreme metal aluminum and painting the inside of the engine cowling and the engine. I didn't use any primer for the cockpit, I never usually do. I don't find a need for it, like most of it is going to be covered up and not be seen too well, so I don't think it's very time efficient to go for a perfect metal finish in these cases. Plus, most of it's going to be stained with castor oil anyway. Then masking off the engine cowling, I mixed a color from XF78 and XF2 to make this sort of dirty linen color that I painted the rest of the parts with. This being a fairly light color, it also serves as a pretty good base coat for oil paints and painting the wooden floor, so I just killed two birds with one stone in this step. Now that we're finished with airbrushing for the inside, we can move on to brush painting. And let's begin with oil paints, I guess. For the wooden floor, I'm using a mix of ochre and faded dark yellow from Optilung 502, and I have a more comprehensive guide on my channel about how to paint these wooden textures, so I'm not really going into much detail here, but it basically consists of taking a flat brush and brushing them on following the wood grain pattern. I'll leave a link in the description on the oil paint video, or it should pop up at the top of your screen. Now that oil paints are out of the way, we can move on to brush painting acrylics. I was always a bit skeptical about Vallejo metallics because, well, the silver color isn't the best in my book. Maybe I got a bad batch, but it's kind of watery and translucent in times. But the brass color really surprised me. It had a great finish and it went on with a pretty opaque layer. While the instrument gauges were drying, I picked out some more stuff with the leather color, and then it was time to put on the decals. In this case it doesn't matter because there's no photo etch instrument dials in this kit, but it really depends because sometimes the photo etch parts are good quality, sometimes they're not, so again, it depends on the kit which one you want to use and which one is going to be better quality. Assembling the control yoke and other small details in the cockpit, I put in the smallest piece of photo etch I have ever seen, this tiny little button. And no, surprisingly, I did not need a magnifying glass for this. Then, mixing a light gray color from cold white and neutral gray, I painted the rest of the metal parts inside. I was sort of painting as I was assembling because, for example, the cage-like parts on the side of the cockpit were a little bit difficult to paint while holding, so I glued them on first and then painted them. Then, mixing a color from flat earth and old wood, I painted the wooden beams alongside of the fuselage. By the way, if you guys are interested in mixing ratios, I'm sorry because, well, especially when it comes to Vallejo acrylics, I usually just mix them right on the palette and I don't have any exact mixing ratios, I just sort of go with whatever feels right. After putting on some of the last details like the photo edge seatbelts, it was time to give some weathering to the cockpit. And keeping things very simple, I simply just added a dark brown panel liner from Tamiya, and I put that in between the planks of the wood grain floor. And no, I did not protect this beforehand with varnish. I was just being extra careful with enamel thinner and cleaning everything up. The engine compartment was looking a little too clean for a worn aircraft, so I took some Bitume Abteilung 502 oil paint and just added some staining from exhaust or castor oil or whatever, and then blended it with a large and soft brush. As we put together the cockpit and while the cement is drying, we can weather up the engine a bit more. And I used my favorite product for weathering engines for this. Engine Grime from AK Interactive. Yeah, I know the name is kind of on the nose and all, and I usually don't like using specific products for specific effects, but this one's an exception. It just leaves pretty realistic looking green and brown and gray looking stains on the engine. And now we can close the two fuselage halves up. The fit on these was pretty good, but, well, it wasn't fantastic, I suppose. There was a pretty significant gap that needed to be cleaned up around the engine cowling, and as well as the tail section, which wasn't exactly even, so that required some sanding as well. The best way to go about this is usually tape section by section off, and then carefully glued together with some extra thin cement. Let's move on to the wings. The single piece wings just required the pin marks to be removed. And then I also put together the top back part of the metal cowling, which had the machine gun mounted on it. There was a cute little photo etch box that I had to glue on from the inside, which stored the machine gun belts, or whatever you want to call them for the Hotchkiss machine gun. Yeah, the thing had a pretty weird feeding system. Let's take care of that unsynchronized baguette launcher, by the way. Unlike, say, German Spandau machine guns, the design here was pretty simple, so the only modification I added was to drill out the gun barrel, of course. There were no really photo etch parts I had to put on, at least for now. So I glued it in place on top of the cowling. Now let's take care of some of those fitting issues I talked about earlier. I used 2 pieces of masking tape to isolate the gap so that the seam and that we're trying to fill is a lot cleaner with putty, and typically it's just, it looks better, there's less hustle when you need to clean it up, and it's just generally easier to work with that way. I then use a combination of different sandpapers, starting with a more rough one and going to a more fine one to sand everything down and make everything as smooth as possible. The propeller was molded in an unusual way because it was molded with the famous casserole spinner on the aircraft, which is an interesting choice, but it didn't really pose any issues. Okay, enough of building, let's get on to cleaning the model with some isopropyl alcohol and begin priming it. For this purpose I'm using an oxide brown primer from Anno. The point of priming is to essentially prep the plastic for paint. Paint adhesion is going to be a lot better with the primer on, and it also reveals a lot of imperfections, dust trapped on the surface, etc. So, for example, if we didn't sand something down perfectly, the primer can reveal that to us and we can come back and resand it and then reprime it. The entire plane was just in a plain fabric color. So once again, I'm using Tamiya wooden deck tan and flat white in, I think I used a 50-50 ratio. I'm sorry if you want precise ratios from me, but I usually just mix colors by sight until I get a shade that I'm happy with. You'll notice that I'm not using pre-shading or black basing or any of those techniques as I'm painting the wings. I'm just sort of slapping the color on flat as it is. I'm going to take care of color modulation later on with oil paints, and rip stripes I usually always do after I already have a base coat put on. Speaking of which, I don't know if these were intended to be used, but the pre-cut masks have these long strips of masking tape, which I simply used to mask all of the rip stripes and paint shading. I masked off all of those protruding bits on the wing, which is where the wooden spar would have supported the canvas on the top. Even with all my efforts trying to conserve as much pre-cut tape as possible, I did run out, and the lower half of the second wing that I masked, I had to make my own cut masks, which I simply matched the same width as the pre-cut ones. Once all of them are masked, it's time to paint some optical illusions. This is done by adding a few drops of dark gray into our pre-mixed color that we used as a base coat and dilute it a lot. Then lightly, and I mean very lightly, spray down the strips of the masking tape. It's very important not to cover the whole wing with the new color, rather just spray along the strips of masking tape that we put on earlier. This will create, you guessed it, an optical illusion. Specifically an illusion of depth, which is going to make the wing feel and look a lot more 3D than it actually is. Then we can get rid of all the masking tape, we won't be needing it anymore. And the result is a light colored strip surrounded by a darker colored outline. We're finished with wings for now, so let's move on to making the fuselage. After base coating it with the same linen color I used on the wings, I masked off the engine cowling as that was painted black. But before that I wanted to add some chipping onto it, so I took some AK Extreme Metal aluminum and sprayed the whole cowling and the propeller cone. I didn't layer some gloss black paint underneath because I'm lazy, but also the plane is going to be very dirty by the time it's finished and we don't need a perfect metal finish. This was followed by 2 layers of chipping fluid from Anno, and once that was dry, I took some flat black from Tamiya and painted over all of these parts. I like to keep my paint layers pretty thin over chipping fluid, as too thick a paint coat can render your previously applied chipping fluid completely useless and the paint simply won't chip. Now that all the painting was done on these parts, I unmasked all of the control surfaces that also had black on them, and of course the engine cowling itself, to do some chipping finally. Using some tap water to reactivate the chipping fluid and a stiff brush, I gently started scraping the paint away to reveal the silver aluminum color underneath. This was done the most around the engine cowling itself, because that part would have been heated a lot and that would have done all sorts of things to the paint layer. But I also added some small scratches on the propeller spinner so it wouldn't stand out like a sore thumb from the heavily chipped cowling. The last bit of painting with an airbrush were the wheels, which I painted with a mix of flat white and dark grey for the tires, after I masked off the rest of the wheel, which was painted black. I apologize, I forgot I didn't film this part. Anyway, this video is already pretty long, so let's just coat everything with a few coats of clear to prepare everything for decals, as airbrush painting is done. And that's gonna be it for today. Apologies for not uploading in a while. I've been fairly busy lately and building and painting models simply was not at the top of my priority list at the moment. I hope you can understand. But I'm really enjoying how the plane is turning out so far. This is my first plain fabric covered aircraft, and so modulation and weathering will be quite interesting for the next episode. Anyway, thank you so much for making it to the end of the episode. If you did, I really do appreciate it. Don't forget to leave me a like if you enjoyed the video or a dislike if you didn't. And subscribe down below if you want to see the aircraft eventually finished. And, well, yes it will, because as I'm recording this, it's already finished. So, you won't have to wait very long for the next videos to come out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, or maybe even learned something new. And, as always, I will see you all next time. Peace.